am attending my husband's wedding. Yes, my dear husband is getting remarried. No, it's not because a mistress took my place. No, it's not because we got divorced. It's because I am already dead, but at least I was lucky enough to pass away peacefully in my sleep. I had thought that after nearly 50 years of marriage with David Carter, even if I wasn't the most important person in his heart, I should at least hold some place in it. But who would have thought? Less than 6 months after my death, he would turn around and marry Olivia Scott? Technically, I am already dead. David Carter had remained faithful to our marriage for decades. Now that I'm gone and he's getting older, I shouldn't be so selfish as to expect him to spend the rest of his life alone. If it were someone else, I would have given him my blessing. But Olivia Scott? Absolutely not. Because Olivia was David's first love. Even their names together, David Carter and Olivia Scott, sound like they belong together. And me, Emily Carter? I was always the odd one out. I stood, or rather, I floated, in the middle of the wedding hall, coldly watching as Olivia walked right through me, making her way toward the stage where David stood. His full head of white hair had been carefully dyed black, and with the energy he carried today, he didn't look like a man nearing 70. If someone said he was only in his 50s, people would believe it, but that wasn't because of his good genes. That was because of me. For decades, I took care of him, made sure he lived a comfortable life. He never had to worry about the household chores, never had to lift a finger. That's why he looks younger than his actual age. Meanwhile, I worked myself to the bone. Literally, in my youth, I toiled in the fields, ruining my health. In middle age, I took night shifts at the factory to make ends meet, which led to a heart condition. At 65, I died suddenly from a heart attack. And as for my counterpart, Olivia Scott, because she never married, she had all the time in the world to take care of herself. She aged gracefully, standing tall and elegant, without a trace of an old woman's frailty. I turned toward my son, Ethan Carter, the son I carried for 10 months, the one I raised with sweat and tears. I had thought that in this matter, my son would speak up for me. But when David said he wanted to marry Olivia, Ethan didn't object. On the contrary, he raised both hands in support. Dad, you've loved Aunt Olivia for so many years. Now that Mom is gone, if you want to marry her, go ahead. I understand how you feel. Remembering his words made my chest ache with bitterness, like my heart was being eaten by ants. As the wedding march played and the couple reached the moment of exchanging rings, I could no longer suppress the sorrow and hatred within me. I floated toward the stage, wanting to knock over the tray holding the wedding rings. These rings were custom made by David. When we got married, I didn't even get a simple iron band. But the infuriating thing was, I was already dead. Now, I was just a soul drifting in the air. I couldn't touch physical objects. So my plan fell apart. I simply passed through the flower girl carrying the rings. Just as I was feeling despair, the wedding hall doors suddenly burst open. A middle-aged woman, now slightly overweight, stormed inside. Her outfit and familiar silhouette made me recognize her immediately. My niece, Sarah Carter. She charged straight toward the stage, knocking over the tray of wedding rings in the process. Even the flower basket was sent flying. The guests were so stunned by the sudden chaos that they forgot to react. The flower girl's parents were the first to snap out of it, rushing onto the stage to pick up their frightened, crying child. While comforting the girl, one of them pointed at Sarah and scolded, "Who are you? Do you even know this is a wedding?" Sarah ignored them. Instead, she pointed at David and shouted angrily, "My aunt hasn't even been gone for 6 months. And you're already marrying the woman she hated most in her lifetime. Do you even have a conscience? Are you even human?" The guests were shocked. David's expression darkened, sensing the situation spiraling out of control. Ethan hurried onto the stage, signaling security and the hotel manager to drag Sarah out of the hall. But as the guards grabbed her, Sarah dodged their hands and pointed at Ethan. "You heartless bastard." I stared at Ethan, my own son, my flesh and blood. "She was your mother," Sarah screamed. "How could you stand by your bastard father's side? You're even worse than him." Ethan's face darkened, and he shot the hotel manager a look, silently instructing him to handle the situation. Then, he turned back to the guests, his face instantly shifting into a smooth, reassuring smile. "Please, everyone, continue eating, continue drinking. It's just a crazy woman causing a scene." Sarah struggled against the guards as they dragged her toward the exit. "Aunt Emily, Open your eyes and look at this world. No one has a conscience anymore. God, how could you be so unfair? She screamed before being pulled out of the hotel. I let out a bitter laugh in my heart. My eyes were already open. But there was nothing I could do. Still, God, why were you so unfair to me? Just as I finished that thought, a loud clap of thunder roared outside, louder than the wedding music playing in the hall. A moment later, I felt my soul being forcefully pulled into darkness. When I opened my eyes again, I saw a familiar yet distant ceiling. Sunlight streamed in through the window, illuminating the slightly yellowed cement ceiling, where an old, dusty light bulb hung quietly. I sat up abruptly, looking around in shock. The furnishings were old-fashioned. Then, it hit me. This was the tiny apartment David and I had rented when we first moved to the city. But why was I here? As I was trying to process it, I heard a faint rustling sound beside me. Turning my head, I saw a young David Carter lying next to me. I was completely stunned. Was this what young people called a rebirth? I pinched myself hard, and the pain was real. It wasn't a dream. I had really come back to life. At that moment, David stirred from my sudden movement. Half asleep, he squinted at me and mumbled, "It's Saturday today. Don't you have the day off? Why are you up so early?" I didn't answer. Instead, I got out of bed and walked straight to the small room next to our bedroom. Inside, a 10-year-old Ethan Carter was sleeping soundly. There was no mistake. This was shortly after David had been transferred to this city for work. Ethan and I had moved here to join him, and we had rented this little apartment to get by. That morning, I sat on the old wooden sofa in the living room, laughing and crying at the same time. God had mercy. He gave me another chance. This time, I would not repeat my past mistakes. At noon, David finally got out of bed. Seeing that I hadn't prepared lunch, he frowned. "Are we not eating at home today?" I looked at him. There was no denying that David Carter was an attractive man. If Olivia Scott hadn't looked down on his job as a small-town teacher, and if his mother hadn't disapproved of Olivia's ways, I might never have had the chance to marry him. David met my gaze, looking slightly uncomfortable at my prolonged stare. But he didn't say anything. Instead, he turned and went into Ethan's room. Soon, I heard the sound of father and son talking. I was used to it. David never cared much about me, my emotions, my struggles, my pain. Before long, he emerged with Ethan. "Mom," Ethan said, "Dad's taking me out for braised pork. Do you want to come?" The way he asked made me feel like a guest in my own home, not its mistress. I shook my head. "You two go ahead. I'll stay here." David seemed surprised that I didn't say my usual complaint about restaurant food being unsanitary. But he didn't invite me again. He also didn't ask if I needed them to bring me anything or even what I planned to eat for lunch. Because to him, I wasn't someone worth caring about. People always treat those they don't care about like that. But now, none of that mattered to me anymore. Heaven had given me a second chance, and I had far more important things to do. I went to the bedroom, opened the closet, and found a small drawer. Inside was a bankbook. When I opened it and saw the balance, 4 yuan, I was ecstatic. Thank God, that incident hadn't happened yet. In my previous life, 3 years after David was transferred here, Ethan and I finally moved in with him. But we could only afford a tiny rental. To give Ethan a better future, I had started working at a local garment factory, hoping to save enough to buy a house in the city for him. But I remembered too well. This money had been used up, and in the end, I wasn't able to buy a home until Ethan was nearly an adult. All I could afford was a cramped 78 square meter 2-bedroom apartment. Thinking about how that money had been wasted made my heart burn with anger. Luckily, this time, that money hadn't been used yet. But right now, buying a house wasn't the priority. Getting a divorce was. Yes, I had to get a divorce. In my past life, David Carter had spent his entire life unable to let go of Olivia Scott. If I remembered correctly, Olivia should also be in this city. Soon, David would meet her again, rather than waiting until I died only to be humiliated by them both. I might as well step aside in this life and let them be together. If I bought a house now, there would be property disputes once we divorced. To avoid unnecessary conflicts, I took a leave of absence from the factory, withdrew the money, and returned to my childhood home in the countryside. The moment I saw my older brother, tears poured down my face uncontrollably. Our parents had passed away from illness when we were young, and it was my brother who raised me. In my past life, David always looked down on my brother, seeing him as nothing more than a poor farmer. After I moved to the city, I rarely contacted him, my brother, not wanting to put me in a difficult position between him and David. Never reached out for help. I only found out later that Sarah Carter, my niece, had gotten into college but couldn't afford the tuition. My brother had been too afraid of burdening me, so he had gone to David directly to ask for a loan. David, however, had refused, using our recent house purchase as an excuse. By the time I learned of it, Sarah had already torn up her acceptance letter and married a construction worker instead. Thinking about all of this filled me with endless regret. Now, seeing young Sarah again, her face still childish with traces of a runny nose, I suddenly recalled how she had stood up for me in my past life. Warmth spread through my chest. This time, I had to change her fate. My brother was surprised to see me. "Emily, what are you doing here? And why are you crying? Did something happen?" I wiped my tears and shook my head. "Brother, I want to divorce David Carter." He was so shocked that he stared at me in disbelief. "Emily, you can't just say things like that. Come inside and talk properly. Why are you suddenly bringing up divorce? Did David say something about you not being educated again? Damn it, it's my fault. I should have found a way to borrow money back then." Yes, in my past life, not finishing high school had been one of David's reasons for looking down on me. I cut him off. "Brother, you are the best brother in the world. This has nothing to do with education or money. David has always had someone else in his heart." "What?" My brother's face turned red with anger. I quickly reassured him and told him everything about David and Olivia. Things I had pieced together in my past life after going through David's old letters. David and Olivia had been college sweethearts. He was known as the literary genius of the English department, and she was the goddess of the music faculty. They fell in love naturally. But after graduation, David had no connections and had to return to a small county to work as a teacher. Olivia visited his hometown once and immediately refused to stay in such a place. On top of that, David's mother had an old-fashioned mindset. She believed a wife should be hardworking and capable. Olivia, delicate and soft, couldn't even lift a hoe. In the end, she didn't pass his mother's test. That's where I came in. The rest was history. After hearing my story, my brother hesitated. "Did David stay in contact with her after marrying you?" I shook my head. "No, not yet, but he will." He sighed. "Emily, marriage isn't as simple as you think. David already cut ties with her. And whatever happened between them was before you got married. You shouldn't dwell on the past. Especially for Ethan's sake." Hearing that, my eyes welled up with tears. I clenched my fists and said stubbornly, "I don't care. I want a divorce. I can't accept this." Seeing how determined I was, my brother softened. "All right, if you really can't accept it, then we'll go through with the divorce. But what about Ethan?" I looked at him and said slowly, "David is a teacher. Ethan will have better opportunities if he stays with him." But the truth was, every time I looked at Ethan, I thought about my past life. Seeing Olivia Scott's excited expression when she married David Carter in my past life still haunted me. I knew those events hadn't happened yet, but the bitterness in my heart remained. My brother said nothing more as I took out the bank book and handed it to him. He looked at the balance in shock. "Emily, where did you get all this money?" I smiled. "I saved it over the years from farming, selling vegetables, and working at the factory in the city." He stared at me with suspicion. "What are you planning?" "Brother, I want you to use this money to learn a skill and open a small shop," I said gently. But he hesitated. I reassured him, "Don't worry, this money is mine alone. It has nothing to do with David Carter." Hearing that, he finally accepted the bank book. I stayed in the countryside for a few more days before returning to the city. The moment I stepped into the house, I was greeted by a mess. Dirty clothes and socks were piled on the wooden sofa. I ignored it and went straight to the bedroom to pack my things. At noon, David came home with Ethan. The moment he saw me, he scowled. "Oh, so you still remember to come back? You just left a note and disappeared, leaving me and our son behind without a word." I looked at him coldly and remained silent. Seeing my indifference, his anger faltered. Then, as if suddenly remembering something, he asked, "By the way, where's the bank book? I couldn't find it." My heart clenched. So, it was happening again. "Why do you need it?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "A friend of mine is in the hospital. He needs money, so I wanted to lend him some." David said, his eyes flickering with guilt. A friend? I scoffed internally. David was always an aloof man, barely maintaining relationships with his colleagues. What friend? It was Olivia Scott. In my past life, during my first year in the city, Olivia had also moved here for work. Coincidentally, she was transferred to David's school. From that moment, he was completely drawn back to her. Behind my back, they often went out for coffee, indulging in the latest trends, while I saved every penny, skimping on meals just to make ends meet. Later, Olivia damaged her vocal cords due to work and needed expensive treatment. David, of course, turned to my savings. At the time, I had already suspected something was wrong and found out about their secret through his letters. When I learned he wanted to give her my hard-earned money, I refused outright. David lashed out at me. Olivia is a singer. Do you know what this illness means for her? If she doesn't get treated, she'll never be able to sing again. How can you be so heartless? Even Ethan had pleaded with me. Mom, Miss Scott sings so beautifully. Like a nightingale. I don't want her to lose her voice forever. Please, let her have the money for treatment. I still refused. I told David that money was meant for buying a house, but he waited until I was at work and stole it anyway, handing it over to Olivia. Now, history was repeating itself. I fought to suppress my emotions. The money is gone, I said, staring him down. I used it for something else. What? David's face changed, and he quickly stepped closer. What did you use it for? How could you just spend all our money without saying a word? I let out a dry laugh. What I do with my money is my business. And by the way, David, that wasn't our money. It was mine. You never contributed a single cent to that account. So why do you think you have any say in how I use it? His face turned red with anger. At that moment, Ethan stepped forward. Mom, please help Miss Scott. She sings so beautifully, like a nightingale. I don't want her to lose her voice forever. Please lend her the money for treatment. It was the exact same plea as in my past life. I looked at my 10-year-old son, and the fragile hope I had for him after my rebirth shattered completely. What did it have to do with me if she couldn't sing anymore? I coldly brushed past them, walked into the bedroom, and took out my packed belongings. David's voice rose in alarm. Where are you going now? Without turning back, I answered, I'm moving to the factory dormitory. And one more thing, David, quote, I want a divorce. David Carter froze for a moment. Then his face twisted with anger. What are you throwing a tantrum about this time? You want a divorce over something so trivial? I let out a cold laugh. Trivial? To him, what even counted as important? Probably only matters concerning Olivia Scott. Haven't you loved Olivia for years? I said calmly. Now that you've reunited, I might as well step aside and make things easier for you too. Emily, what nonsense are you talking about? David's face flushed red, and he nervously glanced at Ethan. Nonsense? I scoffed. The letters hidden in the metal box under the bed. Aren't those proof enough? Even after we got married, you still wrote to her a few times. Didn't you? The only reason you stopped was that she returned them all. David's expression darkened. You went through my letters? He was furious. Mom, please don't fight with Dad. Ethan tugged at my sleeve, looking up at me anxiously. Miss Scott is just our school's music teacher. I looked down at my son. Both familiar and unfamiliar. My sneer deepened. No wonder he was David's son. Even at such a young age, he was already acting just like him. I ignored them, grabbed my luggage, and walked toward the door. As I stepped out, David's angry voice echoed behind me. Fine, you want a divorce? Let's do it, but once you step out of this house. Emily Carter, we are done. I didn't hesitate. I walked out without looking back. My factory boss was a kind man. When I explained my situation, he quickly arranged a dormitory for me. In my past life, because I worked hard and was reliable, he had taken a liking to me. He had even promoted me to a line supervisor. Later on, the factory manager wanted to make me a department head, but when I brought it up at home, David dismissed it. Ethan's college entrance exams are coming up soon, and I'm busy teaching senior students. You should focus on taking care of him. So I gave up the opportunity I had worked so hard for. But now, there was nothing holding me back. I needed to focus on my career. I also wanted to bring Sarah Carter to the city. Compared to our small hometown, the educational resources here were much better. In my past life, she had managed to get into college despite the limited resources she had. If I brought her here, she would have an even better future. Maybe even get into a top university. With that decision made, I wasted no time. I quickly rented a small apartment and pulled some strings to get Sarah transferred into a school in the city. My brother was overjoyed when he heard I wanted to take Sarah in. Emily, I can't thank you enough. Sarah's mother died giving birth to her, and I've been raising her alone. But there are some things a father just can't do for his daughter. It's been tough. I scolded him playfully. Brother, why are you talking like we're strangers? Your child is my child too. Leave Sarah to me and focus on learning your trade. After our last conversation, my brother had started researching what skills would be the most profitable. He learned that big cities were opening more and more restaurants and that skilled chefs were in high demand. So he had written to me, saying he wanted to become a chef. I fully supported him. I might not have known much about future trends in my past life, but I vaguely remembered that around this time, many new restaurants had started popping up in the city. Soon, Sarah arrived. Looking at the shy, quiet girl standing in front of me, I felt a deep sense of guilt. Her mother had died bringing her into this world, and my brother had done his best to raise her alone. When I was still living in the countryside, I had played the role of a mother figure to her, but after moving to the city, I barely kept in touch. Still, she never forgot the kindness I had shown her as a child. That was why, in my past life, she had caused an uproar at Olivia and David's wedding, standing up for me, while I was busy settling Sarah into her new life. David wasn't idle either. I soon heard that he had swallowed his pride and borrowed money from his colleagues to pay for Olivia Scott's medical treatment. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my past life, when we were short on money for a house down payment, I had asked him to borrow a little from his coworkers. He had refused. If we can afford it, we'll buy it. If not, we'll wait. I don't want to embarrass myself by asking people for money. Because of his stubborn pride, we had waited, and by the time we finally saved enough, housing prices had skyrocketed. But now, he actually borrowed money for Olivia Scott's treatment before we even finalized our divorce. The sheer absurdity of it made me laugh. Just as I was shaking my head at the irony, David Carter showed up at my workplace. When I looked up and saw him standing there, I almost didn't recognize him. His face was unshaven, and his t-shirt was stained with dirt. To say I felt nothing would be a lie. In the past, I had always kept both him and our home clean and orderly. Now, he looked like a mess. I haven't come to see you in a while. Are you doing okay? It was the first time David had ever spoken to me so gently. In both this life and the previous one, he had always spoken to me with impatience. What do you want? I asked flatly, mirroring the irritation he once showed me. I think you've had enough time to calm down, he said, his voice careful. I came to bring you home. Ethan misses you. He hasn't been sleeping well. For a moment, my heart softened. No matter what happened in my past life, Ethan was still my son. I had carried him for 9 months and raised him with my own hands. He was just a child in this life, innocent and unaware of the future. But I didn't let that sway me. If Ethan misses me, I can visit him at school, I replied, but I'm not going back home. David, I'm not making a fuss. I truly want a divorce. His expression darkened instantly. Emily, how many times do I have to tell you? Olivia and I are innocent. I never betrayed our marriage. He insisted. She's sick. She's alone in a city where she knows no one but me. I'm just helping her. What's wrong with that? I met his gaze and spoke calmly. Your body may not have betrayed me, but what about your heart? That silenced him. He was stunned for a moment before saying, Emily, don't be angry, okay? Olivia and I really have nothing going on. This is just her most important treatment. But she has to go to another city for it. I need to go with her. Ethan will have no one to take care of him. Just go back home for now. I promise. Once I return, I won't see her again. We can focus on our marriage. A bitter smile tugged at my lips. So it wasn't that he regretted anything. He just happened to need me right now. Suppressing my emotions, I said, I'll take care of Ethan while you're gone. But when you come back, we're going to finalize the divorce. And we'll settle custody too. I didn't wait for his response. I turned around and walked back into the factory, calling over my shoulder, I'll pick up Ethan from school this afternoon. David didn't stop me. He just stood there for a moment before leaving. That afternoon, I picked Ethan up and brought him to my new home. As soon as he stepped inside, his eyes landed on a pair of small girl's shoes by the door. Mom, is there another kid living here? He asked. Turning to me, I knelt to help him take off his shoes. Your cousin Sarah is staying here. She transferred schools to study in the city. Hearing our voices, Sarah came out from her room, glancing shyly at us. Aunt Emily, Ethan, you're back. Ethan's face soured slightly, but under my watchful gaze, he reluctantly muttered, Hi, Sarah. I thought that since Ethan was still just a child, his attitude must have been influenced by David. As long as I guided him properly, I could prevent him from becoming the same person he was in my past life. But the very next morning, he shattered that hope. As usual, I made breakfast, millet porridge, fried dough sticks, and eggs. In my rush, I didn't notice Ethan's expression when he saw the food. After breakfast, I took Sarah and Ethan to school. Their schools weren't the same, so I dropped Sarah off first. She waved at me sweetly before heading inside. When it was Ethan's turn, he suddenly asked, Mom, can you drop me off here? I looked around. We were still about 100 meters away from the school entrance. Why, it's still a bit far. He lowered his head, avoiding my gaze. I just want to walk for a bit. I studied his guilty expression, then looked down at myself. I was still wearing my work uniform, convenient for rushing to the factory after drop-offs. The name of the factory, Prosperity Garments, was printed in large letters across the front. Suddenly, I understood. He was ashamed of me. I took a deep breath, forcing down the sting of disappointment. Ethan, I asked coldly, are you embarrassed of me? I asked him directly. Ethan shook his head repeatedly, but his guilty, evasive eyes betrayed him. I didn't press him further, nor did I insist on walking him all the way to the gate. I simply watched as he ran the rest of the way to school. In that moment, I felt a deep disappointment toward my son. But the moment that truly shattered my hope and made me decide to give up custody of him happened on a quiet weekend afternoon. The night before, I had worked a late shift, so I told the kids to finish their breakfast, do their homework, and then they could go downstairs to play, just as long as they didn't wake me up. But I was still jolted awake by the sound of an argument. Sarah and Ethan were shouting at each other. He might be good-looking, but he's still a homewrecker. Sarah snapped. A homewrecker who ruins other people's families. Ms. Scott doesn't even have a dad. Ethan retorted. She and my dad are just friends. He's only taking care of her. Hearing Olivia Scott's name, I got out of bed and walked into the living room. What are you two arguing about? The moment Sarah saw me, she clamped her mouth shut, her face flushing red. But Ethan turned to me and said, Mom, I think you should put more effort into your appearance. If you dress up a little, maybe Dad wouldn't argue with you so much. Even though Ms. Scott is sick, she still makes sure she looks neat and presentable every day. At that moment, my heart plummeted into an abyss. I stared at him for a long time. Under my gaze, he grew uncomfortable. Dad took you to see Ms. Scott, didn't he? I asked. It was just once, he muttered, looking away. So you think Ms. Scott is better than me, don't you? I took a deep breath and continued pressing. Not really, he mumbled. She's prettier than you, more refined, but you're my mom, and that's something no one can change. So if you had to choose, would you rather have Ms. Scott as your mother? He panicked. No, he denied quickly. But his expression and the flicker in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I didn't ask any more questions. I already had my answer. Maybe in my past life, Ethan had felt this way too. Sensing something was wrong, Sarah hurried over and took my hand. Aunt Emily, I think you're the prettiest. Dad told me that before you got married. You were the most beautiful girl in town. And you're really good at everything. I smiled and patted her head affectionately. Ethan, however, muttered, You've never even seen Ms. Scott. Seeing Sarah glare at him, he shut his mouth. At that moment, all my remaining hopes for Ethan vanished. That day, when David and I had fought, Ethan had been right there. I refused to believe that a 10-year-old couldn't understand what we were fighting about. But I didn't say anything. I didn't punish him. I simply waited for David's return. David finally came back half a month later. After work, I saw him standing outside the factory with Ethan. This time, he looked much better than before. Cleaner, tidier, and even carrying a sense of renewed energy. It seemed that Olivia Scott had recovered. I walked straight toward him. He reached out to take my hand, but I instinctively pulled away. He awkwardly withdrew his hand and forced a smile. Emily, I've settled everything. These past few weeks, I've had a lot of time to think. Let's go home. I promise to be a better husband to you. I stared into his eyes. They were filled with sincerity. But I shook my head. David, if I told you that for the past 10 years, I've secretly loved someone else, but now I've moved on and want to focus on our marriage, would you accept that? His lips parted, but he didn't respond. The light in his eyes dimmed slightly. I let out a quiet sigh. David, let's end this. Let's get divorced. Peacefully. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but I didn't want to hear it anymore. Meet me at the Civil Affairs Bureau at 9 a.m. the day after tomorrow, I said firmly. If you don't show up, I'll file for divorce in court. He stood frozen in place. But I continued. We don't have a house. We don't have much savings. So there's no financial dispute. I'll leave you whatever money we have left. And I won't fight you for custody of Ethan. David's brows furrowed. After all, I added, my voice calm and steady. Compared to a mother who works in a factory, a father who's a respected teacher will give him more pride. I saw Ethan's face flush bright red. David Carter also looked at him in confusion. When I got home, I received a letter from my brother. He told me that his training was almost complete, and in another half a month, he would officially finish his apprenticeship. Not only that, but a restaurant owner in the city was looking to open a new place and had invited his mentor to join. His mentor, however, wasn't interested and recommended my brother instead. Reading that, I felt genuinely happy. In my past life, my brother had spent his entire life working in the fields. In the end, he suffered from countless illnesses. And like me, he didn't even live to see 70 before dying of a stroke. But this time, at least I had changed his fate. Sarah had also adjusted well to school in the city. On her recent monthly exam, she ranked 10th in her class. It might not seem like an outstanding result, but given where she had come from, having to adapt to an entirely new environment while keeping up with her studies, she was already doing exceptionally well. On the way home, I stopped by a store and bought her a hair clip that was currently popular among young girls. Sarah touched it fondly, unable to put it down. But after a while, she hesitated as if she had something on her mind. I noticed and asked, "What is it? Just say it." She gently pinched my hand and asked in a soft voice, "Aunt Emily, are you really sad? Do you really hate Ms. Scott? If you want, I can take my classmates and draw all over her face." She whispered, "I heard from my friends that kids don't get in trouble for hitting people." I laughed, shaking my head before pulling her into a hug. "I do feel sad, but I don't hate her. And who told you kids don't get in trouble for fighting? You have to remember, if you hurt someone, you'll always have to face the consequences." 3 days later, I arrived at the Civil Affairs Bureau early. But David Carter didn't show up until 9:30 a.m., half an hour late, with Ethan by his side. In the past, you never cared about things that mattered to me. Now, even for something as important as a divorce, you still don't care enough to be on time, I said coldly. David's face turned pale. I was late on purpose, he admitted, because I don't want to get divorced. I chuckled. We're already at this point. There's no need for pointless words. His body swayed slightly, but then he reached out and grabbed my arm. "Emily, I know I was wrong. I've wronged you all these years. What Ethan said before, he's just a kid, he didn't mean it. Please, can't you give me another chance? Let me make it up to you." I looked at him with cold eyes and pulled my arm away. He stepped forward again. "Emily, I swear I'll treat you well. These past few months without you made me realize that no one in this world could ever replace you." Ethan clung to my arm too. "Mom, please give Dad another chance. He really regrets everything. He's been sad this whole time." I let out a sharp laugh. "And these past few months have made me realize how much of a fool I've been. How terribly you two have treated me." David's face turned even paler. In the end, we still got divorced. After finishing the paperwork, David left the Civil Affairs Bureau looking completely defeated. He didn't say a word before leaving. Ethan turned to me. "Mom, will you still come visit me?" I replied, "We'll see. If I have time, I will." The next time I heard about David was a year later. By then, I had successfully been promoted to a workshop supervisor at the factory. One day, while chatting with my coworkers, one of them hesitated before speaking. "Hey, I'm not sure if I should tell you this." I looked at her curiously. "Just say it." She hesitated again. "So, my husband went to a parent-teacher meeting for my daughter yesterday. And, well, he saw something." She paused again. I raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Wu, just tell me already." She sighed and finally blurted out, He saw Ms. Scott attending the meeting as Ethan's guardian. I didn't react much, but she continued, lowering her voice. I also heard from other parents that David and Olivia were seeing each other long before your divorce. Some people even saw them all lovey-dovey together at the hospital. Ms. Wu gave me a sympathetic look. I simply smiled. Oh, that? I've known about that for a long time. She was visibly shocked. Then why didn't you ever say anything? Why didn't you go after that homewrecker and make her pay? I chuckled. Would that change anything? If anything, it would just turn me into the joke of the town. I continued. Besides, in situations like this, the man is the one who's most at fault. What's the point of wasting my energy fighting over a man who never truly valued me? Ms. Wu was still stunned. I shrugged. Look at me. I focused on my career, earned my own money, and now my life is better than it ever was before. Why waste my time on things that don't matter? She stared at me for a long time, then sighed deeply. Emily, you're a smart woman. Your life will only get better and better, Ms. Wu said with a sigh. I smiled but didn't reply. Of course, my life was going to get better. My brother had been working as a chef in one of the city's most popular restaurants for a year now. By next year, he was set to be promoted to head chef. He told me he planned to work for another year to save up money before opening his own restaurant. Thinking about the skyrocketing housing prices in the future, I decided to take action early. With some savings in hand, I took out a loan from the bank and bought a property, renting it out immediately. Although housing prices hadn't risen much yet, I knew that in 5 years, this investment would become the foundation of my own business. I didn't see Ethan again until 2.5 years later. By then, my brother had just opened his own small restaurant, although it was just a modest storefront, thanks to his excellent cooking skills and loyal customers from his previous job. Business was doing well. That evening, after finishing work, I went to my brother's restaurant to help clean up. Just as I stepped outside, I noticed a boy lingering near the entrance. I took a closer look. It was Ethan. He was a far cry from the clean, well-dressed child I had left behind. His clothes were messy and unkempt, and he looked thin, almost frail. Noticing my gaze, he hesitated before stepping forward and calling out, "Mom." I was surprised he had come to see me. From what I had heard, after David married Olivia Scott, Ethan had started calling her Mom instead. Oh, right. David and Olivia had indeed gotten married, just a little over a year after our divorce. When I heard about it, I wasn't the least bit surprised. David had claimed he had moved on, but I knew him better than he knew himself. If he had truly been able to let go, he wouldn't have remarried Olivia so soon after my death in my past life. I looked at Ethan, now tall enough to reach my nose but painfully thin, and asked coldly, "Why are you here? Haven't you already started calling someone else Mom?" Ethan's eyes welled up with tears. Without hesitation, he dropped to his knees. "Mom, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please, can you take me away from that house?" I had no intention of taking him in, but my brother, ever the kind-hearted one, pulled him inside and sat him down. He poured him a soda and brought him some food, coaxing him gently. Finally, Ethan spoke. As it turned out, after David and Olivia got married, they had a brief honeymoon phase. Olivia had even treated Ethan fairly well in the beginning, and he had felt proud to have such a fashionable stepmother. But within 2 months, Olivia began complaining about the small, damp, and poorly ventilated rental home. She insisted they buy a larger, newer apartment. David had initially suggested they save up together, but Olivia spent extravagantly, buying new clothes, makeup, coffee, and all the latest trends. In the end, the burden of purchasing a house fell solely on David. His salary alone wasn't enough, so he borrowed money from co-workers and relatives to scrape together a down payment. But Olivia refused to settle for anything less than a spacious, high-end apartment, with an enormous mortgage to pay off. David secretly took on extra tutoring jobs at a private institution to earn more money. Unfortunately for him, a student's parent reported him, and he was fired from his teaching position. Still, Olivia continued her lavish spending habits, and their home became a battlefield of constant arguments. When their tempers flared, they often took their frustrations out on Ethan. It didn't take long before Ethan started missing the life he had with me. My brother looked at Ethan's pitiful face and turned to me, his expression soft with sympathy. I felt a slight pang in my heart. But then I remembered his words in my past life. How he had wholeheartedly supported David and Olivia's marriage. I thought about the things he had said to me in this life. And whatever emotions I had left for him quickly disappeared. Without a word, I turned and walked into the kitchen. Out of sight, out of mind. My brother eventually sent Ethan home, slipping a few $100s into his hand as he left. Later that evening, my brother came into the kitchen to prepare ingredients while watching me out of the corner of his eye. After a long sigh, he finally spoke. Emily, do you think you were too harsh? That you don't act like a mother should? As I washed the dishes, I replied calmly, Brother, do you think I was wrong? He shook his head. No, I just think, my sister has had a very hard life. Hearing those words, my hands trembled, and large tears silently fell into the sink. See? The people who truly love you will always understand. They will see your struggles, your pain, and never judge you for making choices to protect yourself. Years passed. My brother's restaurant grew so successful that he opened multiple branches, even expanding beyond the city. Sarah worked hard and got into a prestigious university. As for me, I finally launched my own factory. Then one day, I heard that David and Olivia had divorced. That night, after a long day of work, I collapsed into bed, exhausted. In my dreams, I found myself returning to my past life once again. I saw the elderly David Carter, even after the scene caused by my niece, still insist on completing his wedding with Olivia Scott. After the wedding, they spent a period of blissful romance, just as they had in this life. David even took Olivia on a honeymoon to the Maldives, with Ethan contributing part of the expenses for the happy couple's trip. But no matter how sweet a relationship starts, it will always settle into the mundane. Olivia didn't know how to cook and refused to do housework. Having remained unmarried for decades, she had no real understanding of the everyday burdens of maintaining a household. When the novelty of marriage wore off, she demanded they hire a housekeeper. However, David's pension barely covered the cost of a housekeeper, leaving them with little extra money for other expenses. And so, at 70 years old, David, the man I had taken care of his entire life, began learning how to cook, clean, and do laundry. At first, he took pride in it, enjoying the challenge, but as time passed and his body weakened with age, the daily tasks became increasingly difficult. His hands lost their strength, his memory faded, and his coordination suffered. He frequently forgot to stir the food while cooking, leaving half of it burnt and the other half undercooked. His attempts at washing clothes were just as disastrous. His frail hands couldn't wring out the water properly when hand washing, and when using the washing machine, he often forgot to take the clothes out to dry. The third time he accidentally threw Olivia's expensive, hand-wash-only designer dress into the washing machine. The two had a huge argument. Olivia scolded him for being clumsy, berating him for forgetting things she had told him repeatedly. David, in turn, snapped back, mocking her for acting like a delicate young woman when she was well past her prime. They shouted at each other, their faces flushed with anger. But in the end, nostalgia for their youthful love softened their tempers, and by nightfall, they had reconciled once again. That peace didn't last long. Olivia soon did two things that nearly sent David into an early grave. When I was alive, I had always been the one to pick up and drop off Ethan's children from school. After David and Olivia got married, Ethan wanted to maintain that arrangement. But Olivia refused. She had her morning exercise, her evening square dancing, and her afternoons were reserved for playing mahjong. She simply had no time to look after a child. With no other choice, Ethan and his wife resumed taking care of their own child. Then, one weekend, both Ethan and his wife had to work overtime, so they left the child with Olivia for the day. David was busy cooking and cleaning at home, so he asked Olivia to take the child outside to play for a bit. Instead, Olivia became engrossed in her mahjong game and completely forgot about the child. It was a scorching 40 degrees Celsius day. The child was left outside for 10 minutes in the sweltering heat before collapsing from heatstroke. By the time David heard what had happened, he rushed the child to the hospital. The heatstroke was severe. The child was admitted straight into the ICU. The daily cost of the ICU was exorbitant, but David believed they still had savings. However, when he checked their account, he found only $2.054 left. Confused, he confronted Olivia. It turned out that Olivia had met a young man at her morning exercise group who had been selling a beauty supplement. He claimed his products could restore youthful skin, making one look as young as they did in their prime. Initially, Olivia didn't believe it, but after attending a few sales presentations, she was convinced and bought 2 boxes. To her delight, her mahjong friends started complimenting her, saying she looked younger. Encouraged, she spent nearly all their savings to buy more. Of course, it wasn't her savings she was using. It was David's. She had spent her youth chasing luxury. How could she possibly have savings of her own? Upon discovering this, David's blood pressure spiked, and he collapsed on the spot, unconscious. Ethan, furious, lashed out at Olivia, yelling at her for her irresponsibility. As I watched the chaos unfold, a voice echoed in my ears. Seeing them like this, does it make you feel better? I didn't know who was speaking. I simply smiled and replied, not better, not worse, just indifferent, because I had long since stopped caring about them. The next morning, I woke up in my clean, comfortable bed, quickly got ready, and headed out for work. There was a long day ahead, and my factory needed me. Years passed, and my life flourished in ways I had never imagined. My brother's restaurant expanded beyond the city, growing into a successful chain. Sarah graduated from a prestigious university with honors, securing a bright future for herself. As for me, my factory thrived, and I became my own boss, no longer bound by anyone's expectations but my own. I had built a life of stability, one where I no longer had to rely on anyone, where I answered only to myself. Then one day, out of nowhere, Ethan came to see me again. He was much taller now, but he looked exhausted, his once proud demeanor replaced by something more subdued. Mom, he called out hesitantly. I turned to him, my expression calm but indifferent. Why are you here? He hesitated before speaking. Dad isn't doing well, ever since he and Olivia divorced. His health has declined. He's struggling financially. I was wondering if you could. I cut him off before he could finish. Help him? I let out a small, humorless laugh. Ethan, you have a father. You have the mom you chose. I'm just a woman you once found embarrassing. His face turned red with shame. Mom, I was wrong. I was young and stupid. I didn't understand. I looked at him, at the grown man standing before me, and for the first time in years, I realized I felt nothing. No resentment, no anger, not even pity. I had moved on. You made your choices, Ethan, and I made mine. My voice was steady, unwavering. You have your own life now. Take responsibility for it. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but seeing the finality in my expression, he stopped. After a long moment, he sighed, nodded, and walked away. As I watched him go, I felt no sadness, only relief. I turned back to my desk, where business plans for my factory's next expansion lay waiting. My life was moving forward, and I had no reason to look back. This was my second chance, and I had chosen to live it for myself.